Welcome to your deep dive. We're tackling a really massive, complex topic today, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And this isn't just about looking at troop movements on a map. According to the high-level sources we've analyzed, this is really a profound collision. You've got history, superpower strategy, and these fundamental questions about, well, who gets to set the rules in the 21st century?
That's exactly right. Our sources, they frame this conflict not just as some regional war, but as the critical challenge to the entire post-Cold War international order. The argument being made is that the world has, decisively entered what they call the post-American era. So our mission today is really to unpack the complex, decades-long origins and analyze the severe ripple effects this conflict has had for the U.S., for a quite divided Europe, and for the global power structure as a whole.
Okay, let's try and unpack this then. Starting where geopolitical tension often seems to start. The history. The roots of the perceived threat. Our sources are very, very clear on where they see the primary cause. It's the continuous eastward expansion of NATO. For Moscow, this apparently created what they describe as an, existential threat. They even frame Russia's eventual military action, using that dramatic Shakespearean analogy, right? Hamlet's question, to be or not to be.
Yeah, and this perceived threat, it's not new. It's rooted deep in geopolitical theory. Core theory. If you go back and reference the early 20th century strategist Halford Mackinder, he established the Heartland Doctrine. Put simply, it's the idea that this specific region encompassing Eastern Europe and Ukraine, it's the core of the core. Control that, and you control the vast world island, and whoever controls that area possesses this, almost unbreakable defensive position. It allows them to ultimately project global power. So for Russia, control over this crucial buffer zone, or at least preventing a hostile military alliance from controlling it, is seen as absolutely paramount. National survival, really.
And the debate inside the U.S. about this expansion, it was fierce for decades, wasn't it? It shows this tension was understood, or at least debated. Our sources lay out these two completely contrasting strategic views. It really shows how we got here.
Absolutely. On one side, you had the, let's say, aggressive pro-expansion view, championed very publicly by figures like Zbigniew Brzezinski. His argument was pretty blunt. NATO expansion, especially over Ukraine, was necessary to completely dismantle the former Soviet sphere and, crucially, to eliminate the possibility of Russia ever reestablishing a Eurasian empire. For those holding that view, U.S. control or significant influence over Ukraine was essential to cement global primacy permanently.
But then, decades before this conflict actually exploded, you had some real strategic heavyweights shouting warnings. We'll have to rewind to 1997. George Kennan, the original architect of the U.S. Cold War containment strategy,
Exactly.
He labeled NATO expansion the most fatal error of the entire post-Cold War era.
He predicted exactly this outcome. He argued that Russians would feel their security, their national prestige, negatively impacted. And he stressed that prestige, for Russians, is a matter of, first importance. The warnings didn't stop there either. Henry Kissinger weighed in pretty heavily in 2014. He warned that for Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country.
He was referencing that deep shared history, wasn't he? Kievan Rus and all that.
Precisely. He reminded the West that Russian history, it begins with Kievan Rus. Russia's religion spread from there. Kissinger urged that Ukraine should be engineered as a bridge between East and West, not used as a front line of confrontation. He warned that any attempt by one side to dominate Ukraine would inevitably lead to conflict or, internal breakdown.
Okay, so the strategic stage was set. Decades of ignored warnings, this growing sense of an existential threat in Moscow. But let's pinpoint the specific actions that finally lit the fuse for the 2022 invasion.
Well, the path was escalating pretty rapidly after 2014. It really kicks off with the color revolution that year. Our sources note this was supported by the West, leading to the overthrow of the sitting pro-Russian president, Yanukovych. Russia's counteractions were immediate, supporting Crimea's referendum to join the Russian Federation and backing militias in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region.
And those attempts at peace, the Minsk agreements in 2015, they seemed like a potential off-ramp, right? Offering high autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk, but, that completely fell apart.
Yes, it did. The sources detail how President Zelensky, elected in 2019, started aggressively pushing for NATO integration, while at the same time linking the Donbas and Crimea issues, which effectively undermine the terms of Minsk. Then, in 2021, Ukraine became a NATO-enhanced opportunity partner. They started conducting these high-profile joint military exercises with Western forces.
Right. And here's where we get to that core strategic calculation. Why the timing? Why the full invasion in February 2022?
Yeah.
From Russia's perspective, what was the moment of no return?
The calculation, according to these sources we looked at, was utterly stark. If Russia waited just 1 or 2 more years, Ukraine would be fully integrated into NATO. This would allow the deployment of offensive missiles that could potentially reach Moscow in perhaps 10 minutes.
10 minutes, wow. That really transforms a traditional strategic border issue into something else entirely, an immediate existential threat to the capital itself. That truly defines that Hamlet moment you mentioned earlier, doesn't it?
It does. This perceived immediate threat drove the military action, which, according to the sources, had 3 strategic goals far beyond just seizing territory. And the scope of these goals, that's what fundamentally challenges the current global system.
Okay, the first one is the regional objective, the one we hear about most often.
Exactly. First, demilitarization, denazification, and neutralization of Ukraine. Basically establish Ukraine as a reliably non-aligned buffer state.
Okay. And the second two, these are the massive geopolitical plays.
Yeah. Second, fundamentally weaken or undermine the existence of NATO, asserting Russia's right to set rules for NATO's activities near its borders, essentially challenging the U.S.'s, let's say, unquestioned dominance within that alliance structure. And third, overthrow the U.S.-led unipolar international order and establish a truly multipolar world. A world where Russia is secured as one of the key global players.
That third point, wow, it changes the entire frame of reference, doesn't it? This isn't just presented as a territorial conflict, it's pitched as a revolutionary challenge.
Yeah.
The entire global system set up after the Soviet Union fell. But is there any indication in the sources that this third goal, overthrowing the global order, was actually seen as achievable through just this regional military action? Or was that maybe more aspirational? Propaganda, perhaps?
Well, our analysis suggests it was seen more as an accelerant. The sources argue the conflict is definitive proof that the shift has already happened, that the era of U.S. unipolar hegemony has ended. Russia's action is framed as merely the most dramatic manifestation of that underlying shift. The transition now to a truly multipolar order, they say it will be a tumultuous process, driven by 2 interacting forces, revolution and reform.
Can you clarify that? Revolution versus reform in this context. What's the distinction they're making?
Sure. Revolution here is basically Russia's approach, a forceful, sudden attempt to tear down the existing system, military and diplomatic confrontation. Reform, on the other hand, is the quieter, more gradual pressure. Think countries like China, India. They're steadily building alternative financial and trade structures, using local currencies instead of the dollar, things like that. Both forces are seen as working toward the same multipolar end, but Russia, well, they took the confrontational path.
Okay. And when we look at the global reaction to the conflict, what stands out as the most compelling evidence, according to these sources, that the U.S.-led unipolar system is actually faltering?
It's the lack of global consensus against Russia. That's key. We have to cite the widespread abstention by countries representing a majority of the world's population, including major players like China, India, Pakistan, large Islamic states abstaining on crucial UN resolutions about the conflict. This signals, they argue, broad dissatisfaction with the current U.S.-led order. And that dissatisfaction, according to our sources, is fueled by decades of perceived U.S. military interventionism. They specifically mentioned the U.S. war since 2003, leading to millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead.
Wait, just to clarify, so even after all the global outcry, the coordinated Western sanctions, the majority of the world's population-wise, essentially stood on the sidelines or abstained, what does that tell us about the perceived legitimacy of the U.S.-led system today?
It suggests that for a large part of the non-Western world, the desire to maintain the current system is maybe less urgent than the desire to see a fundamental change in the global power dynamic. This viewpoint is kind of reinforced by the source's fascinating ranking of responsibility for the conflict itself.
Yeah, it is interesting how these sources immediately jump to assigning primary blame to the U.S. How do they justify that ranking over, say, the direct actors involved in the invasion?
They view it as a long historical trajectory, decades long. They rank those responsible like this. Number 1, the U.S. primary. For treating Russia essentially as a defeated nation after the Cold War, ignoring its security concerns, engaging in economic destabilization. And they point specifically to the shock therapy economic program back in the 1990s.
Shock therapy, it's often just summarized as massive inflation.
Yeah.
But what did it actually involve that was so destructive, according to them?
Well, it was this rapid, massive privatization, designed to transition the economy almost instantly to capitalism. It wasn't just inflation, though hyperinflation did spike to an astonishing 16,000 times in about a year and a half, wiped out average people's life savings. But crucially, the mechanism of shock therapy, it allowed a few well-connected insiders, the future oligarchs, to acquire the nation's immense wealth, its natural resources, for pennies on the dollar. This fostered massive public distrust in the West and in democratic reforms generally.
Right, so that economic devastation kind of laid the groundwork for future resentment, and maybe the desire for a strong leader who promised to restore Russian prestige, reclaim that lost wealth.
Absolutely. That deep resentment against the defeated nation status is seen as the ultimate driver. The sources then rank Ukraine as second for, well, poor political choices, allowing itself to be used as a pawn by the West rather than maintaining neutrality as an independent buffer state.
Okay, moving to the response. The U.S. strategy involves these massive economic sanctions aimed at collapsing the Russian economy. But the sources dismissed this approach pretty heavily. I mean, sanctioning Tchaikovsky and Katz, that sounds less like strategic statecraft and maybe more like emotional retaliation. Does that kind of reaction undermine the credibility of the Western response?
The sources certainly describe the sanctions as hysterical, yes, reflecting the West's genuine shock, perhaps, that Russia dared to challenge their system. However, they believe the strategy is likely to fail. Why? Because Russia is inherently large, resource-rich, self-sufficient in food and energy, and militarily secure. And the key assessment here is highly provocative. If key global players stop recognizing the power of Western finance, the dollar specifically, then that financial instrument becomes, in their words, a worthless piece of paper because it can't reliably buy essential goods like oil or grain anymore.
Wow, that is a profoundly dangerous assessment for the dollar status, if true. Let's talk about the collateral damage, especially in Europe. You mentioned the U.S. potentially gaining short-term capital flowing to the U.S., arms sales, but maybe suffering long-term credibility damage. What's the expert view from these sources on the European Union's role or situation in this crisis?
The EU is characterized by a, quote, lack of strategic resolve, driven primarily by political correctness rather than unified self-interest. That's the assessment. Their major reliance on Russian energy, particularly Germany and Italy, means the sanctions are deeply damaging their own economies, risking massive public discontent as energy prices rise. The harsh consensus from these experts is captured in a really powerful idiom. America is cutting the chives of its friends.
That's a stark image, meaning the U.S. is effectively harvesting the assets and stability of its own allies for its own short-term gain.
Exactly. That's the narrative presented. The U.S. benefits from capital flight out of Europe, increased energy dependence on potentially U.S. sources, while Europe bears the direct economic costs of the sanctions. It highlights Europe's perceived lack of strategic autonomy.
Right. And speaking of global gains, or perceived gains, Western analysts, according to our sources, have a specific view on China's position here.
They do. Some Western analysts consider China to be the, quote, biggest beneficiary of this crisis. China benefits from increased trade with a more isolated Russia, capital potentially flowing into its markets as a stable alternative, and greater global influence for the RMB, the Chinese currency, which is increasingly being used to bypass the dollar system in bilateral trade. Crucially, the sources confirm that the conflict will undoubtedly result in very close relations between Russia and China for the foreseeable future, solidifying a block of resistance, you might say, to the current order.
And if we connect this back to the beginning, what's the final, maybe most significant conclusion about the global power structure that this conflict validates, according to these sources?
The most important conclusion really is that the conflict has confirmed that only 3 nations truly possess strategic autonomy. That's the ability to act independently of others in their core interests and on a global scale. Those 3 are China, the U.S., and Russia. Every other major player, including the entirety of Europe, is seen as dependent or constrained in some way by one of these 3 poles.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for the world going forward? I mean, this deep dive shows us the conflict is maybe less about Ukraine's specific borders and much more about the fundamental structure of global power itself. Systems like the dollar's hegemony, alliance networks like NATO, they seem to be under severe strain.
Indeed. And if Russia were to achieve its stated goal of a demilitarized, neutral Ukraine, it would signal a successful initial phase, from their perspective, of fundamentally challenging the U.S.-led order. The world is now watching very closely to see if global power will shift via revolution, Russia's direct action or reform, that broader consensus among non-Western states pushing for change through economic realignment and institution building.
We often hear about political leaders failing to compromise, failing to see the bigger picture. Our source material highlights a really provocative thought for you, the listener. The U.S. and Europe saw this very special situation of peace and progress after the Cold War, and perhaps mistook it for a permanent, normal state of affairs. When challenged, they simply reverted to historical great power confrontation, the default setting, perhaps, before the fall of the Soviet Union.
And that ties into one final crucial detail, something often overlooked in these high-level superpower negotiations. The sources suggest that even if a peace agreement is eventually reached between Russia and the Ukrainian government, the sheer complexity of internal Ukrainian politics, they specifically mention extreme factions, the enduring power of the oligarchs, means that implementing and sustaining that peace will be extremely difficult. Regardless of what the superpowers agree to, this suggests that the internal state, the cohesion of Ukraine itself, might be the ultimate vulnerability in any attempt to actually achieve a lasting peace.